Tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Jerry White, who is Professor of Modern London History at Birkbeck University, to join this illustrious list of speakers at our Penny Lectures and launch this, new series. Professor Jerry White has been researching London history for over 40 years now, and his body of work includes his acclaimed trilogy on the history of modern London from 1700 to 2000. In 2012, the final volume, London in the 18th Century, A Great and Monstrous Thing, was published, I think completing some 15 years on this project. Tonight, Professor White will discuss his latest book, Zeppelin Nights, London in the First World War, which I know is going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm going to leave Professor White to tell you what aspects of the book he's going to be talking about. There are copies of the book for sale, and I hope it will also encourage you to visit our gallery, which has an exhibition about the First World War, which is a very fine exhibition which complements this lecture tonight. I'm delighted to welcome Professor White. Can we give him a round?
Thank you very much indeed, Ella. It is indeed a very great honour to kick off this new series of Penny Lectures at Morley College. I was delighted to be asked. There are many fascinating things to talk about, I think, in respect of London and the First World War. That we could have constructed a whole lecture and more on, for instance, the capital's first experience of aerial bombardment, and the sort of rather half-hearted defence mechanisms put in place to try to deal with it, or the disappearance in those 4.5 years of the Victorian levels of poverty which had still plagued London society right through the Edwardian period, and which were killed off very largely by a most extraordinary industrial boom which employed, for the first time in London's history, probably everyone who wanted work. Or we could have spoken about the huge drive towards munitions and aircraft production, which definitively shifted the economic balance of power of London from east to west during these years, or the hospitals and the ambulance trains, or the railway stations, and even the prostitution in the Waterloo Road, which figured so largely in some of the anxieties and hysteria of the Home Front, especially in 1917. But I thought that given Morley's heritage, given its long connections with pacifism, socialism, and critical thinking more generally, I'd focus on the question not so much explored so far, I think, in the centenary celebrations of the Great War, at least this year. I'd focus on the question of dissent, of those varied people and organisations who from time to time found themselves at odds with the war's aims or methods. And I suppose I've done so with at least half a genuflection to the proud memory of Michael Tippett, a famous pacifist, of course, who was director of music here before and I think just after the Second World War. This is a talk then about dissent and division opening up during the war, but there can be no doubt that the declaration of war by Britain against Germany and Austria on 4 August 1914 triggered a moment of extraordinary national unity. It was a huge healing mechanism for a very divided society. As is well known, Britain before August 1914 was facing a number of very divisive crises. In Ireland, a very violent civil war appeared to be on the cards. The women's suffrage movement, with its radical militant wing, had disrupted London life with extraordinary outrages of bomb attacks and goodness knows what for months before the declaration of war. And crucially, the class divide in Britain and indeed in London was expressed in terms of some long-standing, bitter industrial disputes, the largest of the time in the run-up to the First World War, a building lockout which had put tens of thousands of London building workers out of work. All of these divisions were the divisions where, as it were, what was absorbing people's minds right through the summer of 1914 until the very end of July. It was only from the very last few days of July that the threat of a European war really hit the consciousness of most people in London, particularly over the bank holiday weekend of 1 to 3 August. It was not clear, really, until the 3rd of August itself, that Britain was likely to be dragged into the war, although that seemed an increasing possibility on the 1st and the 2nd. And it was only really on the 2nd of August that the disparate components of an anti-war movement at last began to show their mettle in London. Hectic organisation had begun around 30 July when the newly formed Neutrality League opened an office in Whitehall with other peace bodies. The League organised a leafleting campaign that flooded their word anti-war rallies London. Anti-war rallies were organised in North London on the Saturday night and most famously in Trafalgar Square on Sunday afternoon, 2 August. Thousands attended, marches converging from every direction, from St George's in Circus, just down the road, the East India Docks in Poplar, from Kentish Town in the north, and Victoria in the west. The speakers included Keir Hardie, H.M. Hyndman, Ben Tillett, and other leaders of the London Labour movement. There was a torrential thunderstorm, but the only trouble came from hilarious, excited young men who pushed their way through the crowd, waving their hats and sticks and singing Rule Britannia. The mood of Londoners remained ambivalent, though tilting to an acceptance that war involving Britain was more likely than not. That evening, Sunday evening, 2 August, after the Trafalgar Square demonstration, R.M. Fox, a socialist mechanical engineer from North London, spoke at a peace rally in Hyde Park. People were realising the gravity of the situation now, and they listened in intense silence while I pledged myself to do everything possible to oppose war. Suddenly, the high-pitched voice of a woman cut across the meeting. Are we to wait till the Germans murder us in our beds? A quiver passed through the crowd, as if a field of corn was shaken by the wind. It was the beginning of war panic. Next day, 3 August, Bank Holiday Monday, everything became clearer. Germany declared war on France, and the implications of its demand for a passage through Belgium began to sink in. The neutrality of Belgium had been guaranteed since 1839 by most European powers, including Prussia and Britain. A German invasion of Belgium, plainly not an aggressor in any continental struggle, seemed an affront to international decency. From this moment, for the vast majority of the British people, the nation's involvement in a war looked likely to be necessary, even essential, if its honour meant anything. This is something which I can't stress too much, that throughout the First World War, the sense of this being a just and honourable conflict in which Britain had no choice but to involve itself on behalf of Belgium in particular, was something which sustained the British nation right to the bitter end. Most people in the British nation and most people in London. Although, as I'll come to show, I think, some of the appetite for this conflict began to wane as the war went on. The change of mood infected almost all the British cabinet too. This was the turning point, experienced almost everywhere. That day, a young London territorial soldier noted, the one topic is, are we coming in? It'll be a black shame if we don't stand by our friends. The socialists, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, were convinced that if Belgian neutrality was defied, we had to go to war. Even staunch liberals, Beatrice wrote that Monday, agreed that we had to stand by Belgium, the position that Sir Edward Grey put that same afternoon to a tense and crowded House of Commons this Bank Holiday Monday. Almost all the chamber wholeheartedly agreed. Yet even then, across London, the mood of ordinary people was wary and anxious. The journalist Philip Gibbs saw no bloodlust in the London streets. None of the old jingo spirit, which had inflamed great crowds before the Boer War, was visible now or found expression, he wrote. Even so, although leafleting continued in London by pacifists and neutrals, Englishmen, do your duty and keep your country out of a wicked and stupid war, the distributors got short shrift from the crowds. Next day, 4 August itself, all the great pre-existing divisions of the nation were healed, temporarily at least. It was a unity that generally stifled what limited anti-war mobilisation there had been. The declaration of war, of course, was 11 p.m. that night, at midnight, German time. There was rapid change in the attitudes of radical suffrage campaigners, for instance. Mrs. Emily Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel threw their considerable energy and organising power into the war effort. The last issue of the Suffragette newspaper was published on 7 August. It later became Britannia. And around the 15th, the Pankhursts announced that the militant campaign was at an end. Votes for women as an objective had not been forgotten, but would now be pursued by other means. The suffragettes' abandonment of militant campaigning trickled out in press notices from the middle of the month as staff, premises and whole organisations went over to war work of one form or another, famously, of course, sewing shirts for soldiers. Of less concern to the Londoners, the divisions in Ireland were quelled for a year and more with an outbreak of unity among most nationalists and unionists over the necessity for war and its vigorous prosecution. The new understanding of the national interest was also widely shared within the labour movement. It took many on either side of the class divide by surprise. This was the most transformative impact of all, I think. Almost overnight, many labour leaders abandoned the internationalism in which they had long been steeped, rejected transnational worker solidarity to prevent war as a utopian dream, and fell readily into martial step. The bulk of the labour movement became vociferously patriotic, the historian of the Labour Party tells us, and that was true for both industrial and political arms. Most of London's leading Labour figures, like Will Crooks in Woolwich, Will Thorne in West Ham, Robert Blatchford of the Clarion, the veteran former Marxist H.H. Heinemann, Ben Tillett of the Transport Workers, who had been on the platform with Heinemann on the anti-war demonstration just on 2 August. Jimmy Thomas of the Railwaymen and others became active on the recruitment platforms, trying to drum up members of their union to adorn khaki. It proved easier for labour men to go along with the war than for pacifists. The outbreak of war was a terrible blow to the peace groups in London. Their morale was shattered, their ranks thinned, their message was everywhere unpalatable, but they never gave up altogether. Of the working class groups, most active were the Herald Leagues, networks of socialists selling the Daily Herald, the paper most associated with George Lansbury, the staunchly pacifist and suffragist former MP for Burn Cromwell, he hadn't been re-elected in the general election before the war. The Leagues had been in existence since 1912, but in the week before the war, new groups had formed to spread an internationalist message of peace. These generally wilted and died away with the shock of 4 August. The most resilient was the North London Herald League, which continued to campaign against the war at open-air meetings in Finsbury Park or nearby. Sunday after Sunday, the only organisation to do so in London through 1914. But even the Herald suffered. Its circulation fell so sharply that about a month after war was declared, it moved to weekly circulation, the anti-war message being broadly unpalatable. The militant Socialist Independent Labour Party, the ILP, tried hardest to keep internationalism alive and generally opposed the war, contrary to the position of the large majority of Labour MPs and activists. The ILP's anti-war opposition was led by Keir Hardie, who died in 1915, and Ramsay MacDonald, both well known in London, though not at this time metropolitan MPs. The party's grassroots membership seems to have organised little collective anti-war activity in London for the remainder of 1914. Individual socialists were, however, brave enough to oppose the war in public. 2 Shoreditch borough councillors were arrested and charged with insulting words and behaviour at a street meeting in Hoxton and bound over in October 1914, for instance. Among middle-class pacifist organisations, the Neutrality League continued to leaflet for a time after 5 August, but then quickly collapsed. The great majority sharing in the bellicose national unity that had kicked in on 4 August included the churches, almost all denominations and sects, and almost all clergy. In the days before war, many had played a part in the London peace movement, but they seemed to have apostatized with an easy conscience. Even the Quakers wavered before reaffirming their historic pacifist allegiance. When they did, they suffered many defections as a consequence. Elsewhere, from virtually every pulpit, congregations were told of their Christian duty to wage war and pray for the victory of our arms with a clear conscience. I'm quoting various sermons. War is allowed by God in the working out of his plan, the rector of St. Peter's, Walworth, confidently affirmed on Sunday, 9 August, and many other comforting formulations were marshalled to convince Christians that killing was no murder. Some went further. The rector of St. Matthew's, Brixton, had the church's prayer books recovered in khaki and used the crypt as a rifle range. Exceptions among the clergy appear to have been very few. Perhaps because of this, they suffered all the pains of anathema. The case of the Reverend K. Dunn, pastor of the Manor Chapel, Southwark Park Road, Bermondsey, became a local sensation in early September 1914. At that time, the papers everywhere were filled with news of German atrocities, real and imagined, many of them real, of course, in Belgium. It was not a good time for the Reverend Dunn to publish his monthly newsletter, reflecting on his return from holidaying in Germany just before war was declared. What a delightful people the Germans are. How kind to the stranger, how human, how cousinly, how Christian, with rather too much of the same. His musings were greeted in working-class Bermondsey with what the South London press coyly called considerable indignation. Tempers boiled over when Dunn tried to speak against the war at an open-air prayer meeting near his chapel on Friday night, 11 September. A large and angry crowd threatened to overturn the rostrum when Dr. Alfred Salter, a local general practitioner and IRP activist who also opposed the war, tried to bring peace to this tiny corner of southeast London. Salter was well known and widely respected locally. "Dear friends," he began. "You ain't got no friends here," shouted a man in the crowd. Salter stepped aside and the rostrum was overturned, Dunn's harmonium thrown down, and Dunn himself severely mauled. The women supporters did their best to protect him. Eventually he was forced by a perfect hurricane of missiles to flee home to the chapel. His windows were broken and other damage done of a serious nature. Dunn was forced to leave the district. For numerous reasons, recruitment, still of course voluntary at the beginning of the war, was robust in London. Some 107,000 men joined up in the first 3 months or so of war, a higher proportion than in the rest of the nation. But as the war began to take its toll on men's lives and bodies, and on family life more generally, enthusiasm ebbed away, while never entirely exhausting the majority view that they were giving their lives in a just and necessary war. These two things, I think, went side by side. One symptom, clear by early 1915, was in a limited return of pre-war industrial strife. Virtually no strikes happened in London from August 1914, when the builder strike was brought to an end in the middle of the month, until about the spring of 1915. An unprecedented set of circumstances, because there had been so much industrial discontent in London before the war. The rising cost of food and other necessities, and long hours of high-pressured labour in many industries, failed to secure adequate reward in the eyes of many workers and their trade unions. Pay claims bombarded employers in both private and public sectors. In London, the worst disruption was caused by a strike over pay and conditions on the LCC's tramways that began to shut down the network from 14 May. Trams, of course, the universal mode of transport of London's working men. There were serious repercussions in Woolwich, dependent on the tramway network, where munition workers depended almost entirely on the trams for their journey to work. Much patriotic pressure was brought to bear on the strikers, many of whom drifted back. The LCC sacked strikers of military age, so I suppose at this time people would give them white feathers so that they would be forced to join up. And many men drifted back to work. Even so, by 1 June, the LCC conceded the main pay demands, and the strikers returned to work, though the position of sacked men was still unresolved. It was around this time, too, that ominous signs of disaffection began to appear in the Metropolitan Police. 3 Greenwich PCs were fined by the police commissioner for recruiting to, quotes, an unauthorised association styling itself the National Union of Police and Prison Officers. We'll come back to this at the end. Another symptom of waning enthusiasm was felt where it hurt most. The war's demand for young men was now insatiable. After the many reverses and great losses of 1915, the battles of Neuve-Chapelle and Loos in particular hit London territorial regiments particularly hard. A monster recruiting rally on 2 October with 6,000 troops marching behind bands along 5 different routes in central London and the suburbs tried to revive metropolitan volunteering under the banner "Wake Up London." The weather was grey and damp, and Michael McDonough, in his article for The Times, confessed that the immediate results of the rally in the recruiting stations were meagre. Privately, in his diary, he noted more worrying signs of division. The marches were accompanied by recruiting sergeants who approached any likely young man in the crowd to cheers, shouts, and fall in with the soldiers. Some, however, showed an ugly temper, some of the soldiers. I heard cries of execration hurled at young fellows who turned away, as most of them did from the recruiting sergeants. A few days later, a recruiting meeting at an amateur football match at the Clapton Orient ground in Hackney was addressed by the mayor of Bethnal Green, who had lost a son in the war. He called it disgusting when crowds of young men surged out of the gates while he was speaking. That same month of October saw a revival of the white feather stuff that had made an appearance before the end of 1940. For some months already there had been talk of the necessity for conscription if too few volunteers came forward. The prospect revived class anxieties for some middle-class observers. Viscount Sandhurst, for one, the Lord Chamberlain in charge of theatre censorship, but he'd been an old military officer, thought conscription would be very difficult to implement in London with its thick and shifting population, where I hear very bad accounts of that seething mass being ready for any mischief. Class, hatred, and fear is one of the sort of subterranean themes of Britain in the First World War. But towards the end of 1915, conscription began to look a near certainty. In August, a national register was made up of all men aged between 15 and 65 not serving in the forces. In late October, Lord Derby, in charge of recruiting, introduced a scheme for men not employed in essential war work to attest their readiness to serve in the forces if called upon. The threat of forcible enlistment, should insufficient men come forward, could hardly have been plainer. The emerging shift from a war fought by volunteers to one fought by pressed men now revived the anti-war dissent that had stayed quiet, or nearly so, since August 1914. Anti-conscription provided a broader platform for criticism than pacifism or international socialism. It made it easier to mobilise public feeling in London to question, if not openly oppose the war, by the end of 1915. The rising number of anti-conscription meetings provoked a vicious response from conservative diehards, whipped up by the so-called yellow press. The Daily Express, with R.D. Blumenfeld as editor, publicising meetings of organisations like the Union of Democratic Control and other groups as an incitement to direct action about patriots. There's no question that they advertised these meetings in order to get people to go there and break them up. A UDC meeting at the Memorial Hall, Farringdon Street, at the end of November was broken up with violence, and so was one in Ilford a week or two later, where Ramsay MacDonald was a speaker. The question, though, was settled in early 1916. Conscription, the forced enlistment of eligible men of military age, came in with the new year. This would no longer be a war of volunteers, but of men who had no choice but to fight. The first military service bill was introduced in the House of Commons on 5 January 1916 and in force by 10 February, calling up all single men between the ages of 19 and 30 that March. But this call on the nation's young men proved quickly as inadequate as all previous recruitment drives, and in May, a much more far-reaching Second Military Service Act conscripted all men, married and single, aged from 18 to 41, and ordered the re-examination of all previously rejected on medical grounds. Large numbers were rejected on medical grounds, generally, most often, because of poor feeding among the London working class. And indeed, most people who went for medicals often failed to come up to the height restrictions. But with the shortage of men, the height restrictions were lowered, and so were the medical standards now accepted by military doctors. This draconian extension of compulsion revived once more old doubts about the patriotic convictions of the London working class. Soldiers were placed in readiness to quell anti-conscription disturbances expected in the East End, and guards at the royal palaces were doubled. The precautions proved unnecessary. Those men wishing to claim exemption from call-up had to present their case to a military service tribunal. These were established in each local authority area, composed in the main of elderly middle-class council worthies, the mayor, aldermen, former town clerks, who chaired the tribunals alongside a War Office nominee, retired senior officers, and frequently a local representative of organised labour. In the early days, many tribunals were made up of adamant patriots who steadfastly refused to grant any exemptions at all, regardless of the grounds on which a case was founded. These grounds were various. No complete statistics of the tribunal's work exist, and indeed, it was believed that most of the papers of the tribunals had been destroyed until something like, I think, 10,000 cases coming before the Middlesex Tribunal were recovered only in the last year or two and are now available at the National Archives. It seems likely that 8 out of 10 applications were based on domestic grounds or for essential reasons of employment, equally split, with another 10% a combination of the two. I'm looking after my widowed mother and I'm running the shop, and if I go, then there's no one to run the shop. My mother starves. Just 1 or 2% claimed exemption because of a conscientious objection to war, mainly based on religious scruples opposing all war, or socialist objections to this capitalist war in particular. Most of the thousands of applicants, and the fact that the 10,000 cases have been recovered in Middlesex just shows how many applicants for exemption there were from conscription. Most applicants in the early weeks of the tribunals found themselves talking to a brick wall. The military representative at the Chelsea Tribunal reportedly dismissed one conscientious objector with the words, "You cur, you ought to be whipped round the streets." But as experience grew, even the war dissenters received a measured, if rarely sympathetic hearing. Efforts were generally made to accommodate them in work at least removed from the mechanics of killing, while still contributing generally to the war effort. Walter Southgate, a socialist founder member of the National Union of Clerks, had his conscientious objection accepted at Stratford Tribunal and was sent to labour in the potato fields at Dagenham Marshes. Similarly, Herbert Morrison, secretary of the London Labour Party, whose blind right eye could anyway have secured him medical exemption, appealed to the Wandsworth Tribunal as a conscientious objector and was directed to work on the land at Letchworth in Hertfordshire, where he absorbed himself in his party duties and in making a detailed study of London history, time well spent. Those who refused these alternatives, or who were not offered them while still refusing to fight, had a much harder time, spending much of the rest of their war in prison. Stephen Hobhouse refused the Shoreditch Tribunal's offer of service in the Quaker ambulance unit as entirely unacceptable. He was arrested and sent to the 10th City of London Regiment, the Hackney Rifles, where his non-cooperation landed him in Wormwood Scrubs on hard labour. R.M. Fox, the socialist engineer and anti-war campaigner, had his conscientious objection rejected by a North London tribunal, and after court-martial at Mill Hill Barracks, served 2 years hard labour in Wandsworth and Brixton prisons. Fenner Brockway took a similar route to Wormwood Scrubs and Walton Jail in Liverpool, and was only freed some 5 months after the end of the war. These men weren't alone. Brockway reckoned that by July 1916, some 19 members of Bermondsey ILP were in prison, and the number grew as older men were called up. Despite the loss through banishment or imprisonment of these leading cadres of the anti-war opposition, the dissent that had begun to show itself at the end of 1915 over the threat of conscription redoubled with its arrival. It began to develop too into a movement for a negotiated peace, and just as at the end of 1915, the anti-war campaigners provoked a violent collective reaction by patriots. The campaigners themselves weren't helped by their own internal differences. The socialist organisations were a world apart from genteel liberal opponents of conscription on the one hand and Christian pacifists like the Quakers on the other. All, though, took bravely to the field on their chosen terrain. The British Socialist Party opposed the war at the traditional street meeting pitches of Leighton Road in Kentish Town, King Street in Camden Town, and in Regent's Park on Parliament Hill at Hampstead Heath. These traditional street corner meeting places had grown up in London from the end of the 19th century and were still very much a part of London life into the 1940s. Sylvia Pankhurst of the Workers' Suffrage, later Socialist League, braved open hostility to meet outside the East India Dock gates or march to Victoria Park. The ILP were active in organising street meetings and marches at Bermondsey. The middle-class intellectuals of the Union of Democratic Control put the case against compulsory enlistment at indoor meetings. The North London Herald League continued to campaign against the war at Finsbury Park, and the Christian Socialists of the Brotherhood Church in Southgate Road, Islington, Hackney, depending on which side of the road it was, played ecumenical host to many different anti-war dissenters. But with the 2 military service acts in operation from May 1916, it was the No Conscription Fellowship that began to play a leading role in anti-war dissent, organised on the narrow front of no conscription, but in fact basing their propaganda in a wider movement for peace. The NCF had its origins in late 1914 pacifism, opened a London office in early 1915, and really came to life with its first national convention as conscription began to appear a near certainty in November 1915. It had a national membership and organisation, though its business was necessarily metropolitan in focus, if only because of its daily engagement with the War Office over the treatment of conscientious objectors by the tribunals and by the army. In London, at least, it occasionally acted as an umbrella organisation, linking separate local anti-war groups. There was a South London Federal Council Against Conscription by early 1916, for instance. The NCF was never suppressed by the authorities, though its publication, The Tribunal, was shut down, its printing presses seized, and many members were arrested and imprisoned as the war went on. But it lived in the shadow of suppression, such that it had a secret duplicate organisation ready across the nation in the event of government moving against it. These were dramatic times. The NCF and the other dissenting organisations in London lived in interesting times in those first months of conscription in early 1916. Coupled with the fear of arrest came the danger of a beating from those resentful Londoners who viewed pacifists as not only undermining the war effort, but negating the sacrifice of so many sons and brothers on the battlefield. And one can sense here the personal sense of outrage that many people felt at people refusing to go to war when their sons and brothers, uncles and so on, had been killed or wounded on the Western Front. Public meetings in the parks were broken up by hostile crowds. Street speakers were hustled and silenced. Meetings were cancelled when local authorities and others discovered that their rooms were to be used by pacifists. It was said that men and women leaving NCF meetings were roughly handled, pelted with stones and struck on the head with sticks. The police, metropolitan and city, were accused of joining in the abusive language and doing nothing to protect the dissenters from violence. Free fights broke out on the floor of the Brotherhood Church, the opposition frequently led by soldiers in uniform and on leave, there to give the pacifists a bashing. Most famously of all, at an anti-conscription march and rally in Trafalgar Square on 8 April 1916, the plinth was stormed by Anzac soldiers, Australians and New Zealanders, mostly Australian. The speakers were unceremoniously bundled, women and men alike, to the ground. Towards the end of the year, the Military Service Acts had begun to spawn a different sort of violence in London, with the roundup or comb-out of crowded places where young men congregated. These were carried out by the police and the military, the latter seeking inappropriately to impose an unwanted discipline on the civilian Londoner, and frequently, by all accounts, overstepping the mark. At the Chiswick Empire Music Hall in September 1916, for instance, army officers took the stage at the end of the performance and ordered all men of military age, broadly interpreted, to remain behind while their call-up papers and exemption certificates were checked. An entirely unnecessary roughness was shown by some of the army officers in cross-examining perfectly innocent persons while the police behaved with consideration and courtesy. That same month, a roundup at the Ring, the South London boxing venue in Blackfriars Road, led to exciting chases over the Southwark rooftops. And in November, a raid said to involve police and 200 soldiers on a Soho working men's club led to complaints of watches, rings and other valuables being pocketed by the military. It was around this time that the production of false exemption and medical certificates became a prosperous and ingenious backstreet industry in London. The forging of these certificates became quite a way of life, I think, in some parts of the East End and South London. Another division reopened in British unity during the course of 1916. Conscription was not applied to Ireland for fear of a nationalist backlash, though volunteering had continued across the nation, especially in the north. But the nationalist spirit had not been quenched. The Easter Rising in Dublin came as a shock to the superstructure of wartime unity created in August 1914. There were repercussions in London with raids on the Gaelic League's London premises in May and on Irish clubs in Hackney and elsewhere in July and August. That same month, Sir Roger Casement was hanged for treason at Pentonville Prison. He had been convicted for organising an Irish brigade in Germany to fight among British prisoners of war, to fight for the Kaiser and trying to run German guns to Ireland. The dissent that began confidently to express itself in 1916 was enormously strengthened during 1917 by events both domestic and foreign. It showed itself first in the industrial unrest that shook country and government in the spring of 1917. By May, food prices were almost exactly twice what they had been in July 1914, and they continued to rise until they peaked at 106% in September. The various shortages and uneven supply added to the discontent, and with it all went a feeling that some at least of the price rises were due not to genuine difficulty in securing supplies, but to profiteering, a word assuming large importance during the year. With wage rates generally failing to keep pace with this rise in the cost of living, many workers agitated for more pay and struck work when they didn't get it. The London bus workers came out in May for changes to union recognition and a rise in pay. For 3 days, London was virtually out of buses. We were facing a bus strike, I think, over the weekend. Any travelling is done by underground. Imagine the crush there, one diarist complained. After government intervention, the strikers went back on the promise of an industrial conference and consideration of the pay claim as a war bonus. The More worryingly for government, unofficial strikes of munition workers in Lancashire spread all over the north of England and then to the London munition-making districts. Wage rates were one important grievance, and so were threats by management to withdraw exemption certificates from military service for men not considered to be pulling their weight. There were strikes of skilled engineers in Crayford, Erith, that's the Vickers machine gun works, and shell-making factories, and chiefly Woolwich, the great armaments factory, bringing out where there were 75,000 workers in 1970, bringing out thousands of workers who, though not on strike, depended on tool makers to keep their machines running. 8 of the strikers' leading shop stewards were arrested under the Defence of the Realm Act and brought to Bow Street, where they were remanded in Brixton Prison. And there were police raids subsequently on trade union premises in London. Under this formidable pressure, the strike was settled and the men returned to work with a promise of no further victimisation. Even so, when the Minister of Munitions and the General in charge of the Armed Forces went to Woolwich to talk to men, they found some difficulties. I'll come on to say it. Government inquiries into the causes of industrial unrest this spring made worrying reading. The inquiry into London and the South East concluded that the unrest is real, widespread, and in some directions extreme, and such as to constitute a national danger unless dealt with promptly and effectively. We are at this moment within view of a possible social upheaval, or at least extensive and manifold strikes. The cracks have really begun to show then in this unity which had been forged overnight in August 1914. There were deeper anxieties for government that spring and early summer of 1917 that perhaps made industrial unrest, at least in London, seem more threatening than it really was. The pressures of war had begun to have a destabilizing impact on the social and political system of competent nations, and one victim had already fallen. News of the First Russian Revolution and the abdication of the Tsar reached London on 16 March. It gave heart not just to British Democrats, but to all those who opposed the war and its continuation. On 31 March, a vast rally at the Royal Albert Hall to rejoice over the revolution was filled with an audience of nearly 12,000. A further 5,000 were turned away at the doors. The revolution was fancifully seen by many in authority to be irritating, if not directly causing, the industrial unrest that spring. Yet, while there were more than enough domestic provocations for industrial strife, it's clear that the Russian experience was one buttress of working-class self-confidence after March 1917. When the Ministry of Munitions went to talk to munitions workers at Woolwich, to a meeting of 2,000, they were greeted by a chorus of the red flag. But the revolution proved a two-edged sickle. Fears of communism and of importing the social and political anarchy prevailing in Russia provided a shot of adrenaline to powerful forces among the die-hard patriots and their supporters. A peace procession at Victoria Park in April was broken up with great violence and considerable bloodletting, with Australian soldiers, vigorous fighters on the pro-war side. Whenever there was trouble in London, there was an Australian soldier in the middle. In late June, a debate in Finsbury Park between Harold Lee and Havelock Wilson, the Seamen's Union leader and a fanatical spokesman for the pro-war faction of the Trades Union Congress, saw the pacifists swept bodily from the park. The forces against them were spearheaded by 200 torpedoed sailors, a lot of merchant sailors were being shipwrecked at this time, brought from merchant ships in the port of London by Captain Edward Tupper, Wilson's henchman in the Union. After that, I sent men Sunday after Sunday to disrupt the pacifist gatherings at Finsbury Park and elsewhere. Tupper boasted years later. The seamen became the national champions against pacifism. Pro-war politics was also bolstered by a new grouping on the far right. This was the National Party, formed at a Queen's Hall meeting that August and led by never-endians, or those who wanted abject surrender of Germany as a war. Diehards like Lord Charles Beresford, General Page Croft, noted Puritan, and Havelock Wilson the Seamers. It says much for the resilience of the peace movement in London that its meetings and propaganda continued throughout the war, the year, of 1917, despite intolerable levels of violence, including an attempt to set the Brotherhood Church in Southgate Road on fire when a meeting was in progress there. And a month later, in the aftermath of Lenin's Bolshevik coup in Russia, and amid growing fears of revolutionary influence paid for by the same German gold that had helped bring Lenin to Petrograd, a state crackdown on pacifist headquarters in London led to extensive police raids and arrests. More than a dozen London organisations were raided under the Defence of the Realm Act, including the No Conscription Fellowship, that's when their printing press was seized, the National Council of Civil Liberties, and even the Indian Home Rule League. Any organisation which was against Britain, against the war, was vulnerable at this point. The repression by the authorities on the one hand, and the violence meted out to dissenters in the streets and parks of London on the other, undoubtedly took its toll and helped mute protests during the second half of 1917, and into the final year of the war. It was a war that continued to produce terrible shocks, with one more great crisis to come. The Ludendorff offensive of March 1918, which swept the British before it, with the loss, captured and killed of tens of thousands of men, seemed to threaten a sudden and unexpected defeat, or at least a negotiated peace on terms unfavourable to the Allies. There was a panic-stricken response. The overriding objective of government was now to recruit ever more men for the army bleeding on the Somme. Exemption certificates were rapidly withdrawn from young men in some protected employments. On 18 April, conscription was extended to Ireland, and the upper limit rose to include all men aged 51 under. Dealing in horses for town use was banned, so that every available horse might be requisitioned for the front. And comb-out raids began again, one on an auction at the Horse Repository in Newkent Road, serving both purposes and ending in 50 arrests, many Irish horse traders. Meanwhile, recruitment of the older men got underway. One diarist's husband, nearly 46 and in delicate health, attended for a 2-minute medical examination. To her distress, was past grade 2 and fit to fight. It's a mistake. He'd never stand the physical labour of the Tommy in the ranks. He was a well-known London solicitor. And John Dalesworthy, 50 years and 343 days old, was examined and to his relief was totally rejected on score of sight. Must say, this manpower bill was a case of panic legislation, if ever there was one. At the same time, strikes broke out in an echo of the industrial unrest of the previous year. In August, London's buses and trams were halted for some days by a strike of women workers, striking for equal pay. Men had been given a war bonus, but the women hadn't. In September, worrying indeed for the war effort, a railway strike spread to the Great Western Railway and closed Paddington Station for a time. The railway is absolutely essential for getting men to the front, of course, and ammunition. Worries over the temper and loyalty of the workers in the East End once more induced the authorities to move a company of Scots Guards to Stratford in order to snuff out any trouble should it start. But most disturbing of all for the Londoners was a strike by Metropolitan police officers on 30 to 31 August. It seemed to indicate that the very fabric of civil society in the capital had been shaken, even ruptured. Indeed, Lloyd George told a confidant he had been really face to face with a revolution. This appeared to be London's Petrograd. We might remember that the police officers' grievances had been brewing for some time. The oldest was over recognition of the National Union of Police and Prison Officers as a negotiating body for the men. Sir Edward Henry, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, a former Indian civil servant, had outlawed it since the war. And in 1916, some officers were dismissed when it was discovered they were members. The immediate linked cause was pay. Linked because the men argued that if they had a union, then their pay would never have dragged so far behind the cost of living, as indeed it had. There was a third but subsidiary grievance over the inadequate pensions given to the widows of men dying in the service. This last complaint had Henry's sympathy, and he was pressing the Home Office to take action that August. But the first claim for trade union recognition was anathema to him as entirely inappropriate and enforced under something close to military discipline. and the second, increased wages, he shelved, worried it would get in the way of a rise in pensions. This last was a fatal error. Had the demand for improved pay been heeded, it's inconceivable that a strike over union recognition alone could ever have been managed. The strike began at just after midnight on Friday, 30 August. Police stations next morning were frequently surrounded by cheering strikers and found themselves with just 1 or 2 PCs to deploy. Some areas, like the Tower Bridge Police Stations district in Southwark, a notoriously tough district, had not a single officer to put on the street. When the Star, a popular London evening paper, sent a reporter into the West End, he came across just one policeman. Later in the day, City of London police officers joined their metropolitan colleagues on strike. Soldiers in the tin hats of active service and bearing rifles with fixed bayonets were called in to guard government offices where policemen had formerly stood. The strike went on until 31 August, Saturday. After a meeting with the strikers' representatives with the Prime Minister convened at his urgent request on the Saturday afternoon, the men were quickly granted their pay rise and promised a negotiating machinery which in the event fell short of union recognition. There had been an amazingly calm response by the London public during the absence of police on the street. Some looting was noted. The South London Press talked of 70 burglaries happening over that 48-hour period, but there was no unrest, given, as it were, the social complexity and need of the time. Sir Edward Henry shouldered the blame and was forced to resign. There would be a further strike that proved a final defeat for trade union aspirations in the police force in 1919. The pay rise having been conceded, there was no appetite in the police force to strike for the union. What does all this add up to? Although the carapace of unity that kept the British people fighting the war to the bitter end was now shattered during the 4.5 years, not in the way that it was shattered in Germany by revolution, starvation through food shortages, and complete breakdown of public order. The carapace of unity was certainly fractured during the years from 1915 to 1980. And you can see the cracks getting deeper and wider year after year, from 1915 through the conscription period of 1916, the period following the Russian Revolution and the industrial strife of 1917, this sort of final climax of industrial breakdown with the Metropolitan Police strike in August 1918. By then, August 1918, as we now know, but as people didn't at the time, Londoners had not many more months of anxiety to encounter. The German push, the Ludendorff push of March 1918, overextended itself, was halted, then pushed back. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of newly trained American troops helped give the Allies overwhelming force. The internal divisions within Germany proved vastly more destructive of the political and social fabric than the reopened class divisions within Britain. And the armistice, founded on Germany's abject surrender, followed on 11 November 1918. That surrender, of course, would sow the seeds of an even more destructive war, terribly more destructive for London too, 21 short years further on.